let's talk about the valley of depression just for a moment. Number one, it is a valley of darkness. Darkness. We see that darkness in verse 3. He says, He hath made me to dwell in darkness as those that have been long dead. Then look, if you will, at verse 4. The Hebrew word translated overwhelmed carries with it the idea of being enclosed by darkness. In David's mind, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. His whole world seemed to be engulfed by darkness, and there appeared to be absolutely no ray of hope whatsoever. And then notice that Hebrew word translated desolate in verse 4 means to be stunned. In other words, David is totally shocked that this is even happening to him in his life. His own son betraying him. No doubt over and over again he asked himself the questions, how can this be happening to me? Why would God allow something like this in my life? What am I going to do? How many of you have ever asked those questions before? Then notice that word faileth. It means to be at the end. David felt that he was at the end of his rope. Not only had his own son turned against him, but the Bible says that even his very best friend, Ahithophel, had betrayed him. Psalm 41 verse 9 says, Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. David is saying, my very best friend, Ahithophel, he would sit at the table, he would eat dinners with me. I thought he was my friend, but he betrayed me along with my son. David had convinced himself that he was not going to make it through this valley. It's as if he lost all heart to go on. Maybe you've been there in that valley. Maybe you're in that valley right now, where you fear that the outcome is not going to be good. And you are overwhelmed with the darkness and the despair of where you are in life right now. I want you to understand that it is a valley that you go through. You don't stay in that valley, you go through that valley. Notice it is also a valley of discovery. Not only a valley of darkness, but a valley of discovery. I want us to see several things that David learned in this valley of depression. All right? Several things that he learned, and I'm going to be very quick here this morning. Number one, he discovered the importance of getting his focus back on God. That's important whenever you're depressed, to get your focus back on God. We see this in verse 5. Look at it again. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. Whose works? God's works. I muse, or I reflect on the work of thy hands. He said, I reflect on what God has done in my life. You see, David began to think about all that God had done in his life over the years. And the more that he thought about it, the more he was convinced that God had been at work in his life all along the way. And as David reflected back over the years, he was reminded that God was sovereign. What does it mean when we say that God is sovereign? It means that God is in control. That's simple. God's in control. When life seems to be spinning out of control, we must get our focus back on the one who is in control. And that's what David did. God can take the bad things that happen to us and bring something good out of them. That's why we need to take our focus off of our problems and put our focus on the one who can fix the problems. I have said this before, but it's hard to stay depressed when your focus is on the Lord. Yeah, if your focus is on the problems, you're going to be pretty depressed. But the way to go through that valley, if you want to stay in the valley, keep your focus on the problems. But if you want to go through the valley and get beyond the valley, then get your focus on God, because there's nothing to be depressed about when you think about your awesome God. Number two, he discovered that God was still there for him. God was still there. We see this in verse 6. I stretch forth mine hands unto thee. What a beautiful picture of just reaching out to God. Lifting his hands toward heaven, saying, God, I know that you're there for me. The God of yesterday is still the God of today. You see, verse 5 deals with yesterday. All that God has done in the past. But then we see in verse 6, today. The God of yesterday, the God who was in control, is still the same God who is still in control even right now. Maybe Absalom had deserted him, but God would never desert him. Maybe Ahithophel had deserted him, but not God. God was still there, and more than anything or anyone else, David needed God. That's why he says, my soul thirsteth after thee. God may feel like he's a million miles away, but in reality, if you will just reach out, you will discover that he has not gone anywhere. He's still right there with you. You say, well, I feel all alone. I'm depressed. I'm in a very dark period of my life right now. Get your focus back on God. Think about all that he has done in your life. Be reminded that God is sovereign. God is in control. And also, you need to discover that God is still with you. He has not abandoned you. He has not deserted you, but rather he has promised that he will be with you every step of the way. And even though you may look around in your life and say, where is God? God is there. God is there. And some of us today need to be reminded that God is always with us. Always. There's a third thing that he discovered, and that is he discovered the privilege of prayer. The privilege of prayer. We see this in verse 7. He says, hear me speedily, O Lord, my spirit faileth. I don't know about you, but I had godly parents that were always teaching me the value of prayer. The older I get, the more grateful I am for the Christian parents that raised me in the way of the Lord.